35 years ago, Don Bluth, who had worked for Disney Animation, took a huge risk, sacrificing his time, money, and reputation, all for a little children's story from 1971 called Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. The resulting film, The Secret of NIMH, is still, 35 years on, unquestionably one of the most stunningly and classically animated features of all time, and also one of the most beautiful stories ever told, I think. And that is why on the eve of its 35th anniversary, we're going to look back on what exactly makes The Secret of NIMH such an enduring classic. It's no secret that Disney was not at their peak in the 1970s. The Aristocats, Robin Hood, The Rescuers, they were alright, but the animation was not up to the standards that Disney had set in decades previous. Don Bluth was feeling dissatisfied as the 80s began, and he wanted to make something beautiful and meaningful, and he wanted that something to be The Secret of NIMH. But when Bluth brought the idea of NIMH to Disney, they rejected it. They already had a mouse mascot, they said, and they'd already done The Rescuers that also featured mice. Let's off the darn mice! I'm paraphrasing here. So Bluth and a team of former Disney animators left. Many mortgaged their homes, and during the over 2 years it took to fully animate The Secret of NIMH, they sometimes worked out of their own garages, often well into the night, for no extra pay or even hope on return of investment. And what I think you can see immediately is the depth of the animation. The shadows and the detail in the backgrounds are just stunning. And something I think is especially impressive is how the animators struck that perfect balance in the style of the characters. The mice, the rats, the rest, they're never fully humanized. There's always something distinctly animal to their movements. What you wind up with is the perfect blend of the real and the fantastic. And I think that's the perfect way to describe the story too, which Bluth's team admittedly took some liberty in adapting. The original story was science-driven and focused much of its attention on the Rats of NIMH, who had been injected with a serum by humans that had the side effect of making them hyper-intelligent. They also had to change the lead character's name from Frisbee to Brisby because Frisbee. Yes, really. The Secret of NIMH is really about one woman/mouse, Mrs. Brisby, who must find a way to protect her children from the farmer's plow. Normally, she would only need to run, but her youngest, Timmy, has pneumonia, and so she must go to extraordinary lengths to find an alternate solution. And she is a very brave mouse. She seeks the aid of a giant owl who eats mice. She seeks out the rats, who the rest of the animals on the farm are afraid of. She faces off against a giant cat who is, a giant cat. She fights against one of the rats' own dangerously misguided leaders. She fights against nature itself, and she wins. And throughout, we are reminded of just how dangerous and dire her circumstances are. There is a lot of death. We see mice sucked up into the air vents. The rat's leader, Nicodemus, is crushed to death. The villain is stabbed in the back, and there's a bunch of blood too. It's a kid's movie. Even before the story begins, Mrs. Brisby's husband dies. She is a widow, still grieving her partner, and yet, after being pushed at first by others, she finds the strength within herself to do the impossible. And she triumphs. She saves her family, and she inspires, basically everyone. I don't know about you, but I wish more kids' movies were like that, blood and all. And there are so many great characters. Dom DeLuise plays a crow named Jeremy who makes for great comic relief. John Carradine plays the absolutely terrifying Great Owl, and Derek Jacobi plays the mysterious Nicodemus, leader of the rats, to perfection. Every line he speaks is ominous and beautiful, and it gives me the chills every time.
Courage of the heart is very rare. The stone has a power when it's there.
But there are, I think, 3 standouts in the story. The only other mouse involved with the rats, Mr. Ages, who, like Jonathan Brisby, escaped NIMH after being shot with the drug that made him smart. He is the only surviving mouse from NIMH, and his character is often alienated from the other mice and the rats because of his survivor's guilt. There's Auntie Shrew, an older woman with no children, who is no saint, but you can tell she understands how important it is for the community of animals to protect one another from the farmer. And then there's Mrs. Brisby, played by Elizabeth Hartman. This was her final role before she committed suicide some years later. And there's such an intense sadness in Hartman's performance, and there should be. Mrs. Brisby is constantly coping with the challenges of losing her husband while shielding her children from constant danger. I only wish Elizabeth could have found the hope within the hopelessness the way Mrs. Brisby does. Hope within hopelessness is a big part of The Secret of NIMH's message, but it's not the only one. The Rats of NIMH are in a quarrel over their future. Nicodemus believes that the rats must stop stealing from humanity and begin their own society, while the villain, Jenner, believes the status quo should remain and that the rats should take what they can while they can. It's a familiar conflict. Should the oppressed throw off the yoke of their oppressors and begin anew? Or is incremental change within a system gamed against you to the point of slavery and death still better than having to start over entirely? And while the original book doesn't contain this conflict, the drama it adds is a potent one because it's a question many people face every day. And there aren't any easy answers to it. Jenner is the bad guy, but only because he'll go to any means, including murder, in order to protect the life he knows out of fear. There's another related major change from the book in the form of a mystical amulet, which Mrs. Brisby uses to save her family when the rats fail to. The magic is meant to represent the power of a mother's love and bravery in the face of even the most impossible odds. The rats spend most of the movie bickering amongst each other. It's only when they see the courageous heart of Mrs. Brisby that they realize they can begin anew. Mrs. Brisby doesn't just save her family, she saves the rats too, from themselves. Not a lot of movies out there, animated or otherwise, are about the courage of mothers, which is maybe the most potent and beautiful thing of all about The Secret of NIMH. Also, the score is so sad but hopeful that it will fill you up until you burst into tears. I swear, that is no exaggeration. It gets me every time.
Let your dreams come true, future songs and flying dreams.
Whether it's 35 years or 50 or 100, the messages and the stories and the characters in Secret of NIMH remain as powerful and as relevant as they did when the film debuted in 1982. So, if you're looking for a great movie for your kids or yourself, you're still allowed to watch cartoons, I would highly recommend watching The Secret of NIMH. Just, keep a hanky nearby. You're gonna need it. See you next time.